We're moving now from the general theory of punishment to capital punishment in particular. Although the death penalty has been abolished in most of the world, it's vigorously debated in the United States. It raises all the philosophical issues of punishment in general, and then some. For many centuries, capital punishment was used for a wide range of crimes, but in the past century its use was narrowly restricted to the most serious crimes, such as child rape, aircraft hijacking, treason, and certain murders. The central philosophical question is whether, given current institutions and social conditions, a death sentence is ever morally permissible for premeditated murder. Retentionists believe that it is. Abolitionists disagree. Let's begin by considering retributivist arguments for retention. In a previous lecture, I discussed the flaws in lex talionis, but capital punishment is one case in which the principle actually has some plausibility. It seems just to kill someone who's killed. Retributivist retentionists argue that someone who doesn't respect the lives of others has waived his own right to life and deserves to die. Executing him is at least morally permissible. Some retributivists make the stronger claim that nothing short of execution gives killers what they deserve. One objection to the use of lex talionis by retentionists is that they use the principle selectively. Retentionists don't favor punishing crimes other than homicide in accordance with lex talionis. They don't advocate maiming those who maim, stealing from those who steal, or raping those who rape, to say nothing of attempting to kill those who attempt to kill, which is just silly. Retentionists can respond that lex talionis is only appropriate to crimes that cause harm, as homicide does. They then face other objections. All homicides cause death, but some aren't criminal acts at all. Some homicides are pure accidents for which no one is to blame. Even within criminal homicides, some are more culpable than others. No one favors executing everyone who commits criminal homicide. That would include a mother who recklessly and inadvertently drives over her own child, killing him. She's guilty of vehicular manslaughter, but no one thinks she should be executed. Retentionists must qualify lex talionis to cover perhaps only murders, not all criminal homicides. Most retributivist retentionists today reject lex talionis. They argue instead that execution is a proportionate punishment for the worst murders. Some emphasize the expressive function of punishment and suggest that execution uniquely expresses to the convict and the public at large the condemnation we feel for murderers. Let's turn now to a different kind of argument for retention, consequentialist arguments. Consequentialists believe that everyone has an all things considered moral reason to promote the best possible overall consequences. Utilitarianism is the classic form of consequentialism, pioneered by the English philosophers Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick. Utilitarians are maximizing welfarist consequentialists. They believe that we have an all things considered moral reason to maximize total welfare. How might a utilitarian lawmaker go about deciding which laws to support? For simplicity, imagine she has to decide between two bills. She must vote for one or the other. In theory, her process goes like this. First, she reads both bills and tries to predict the consequences of each for human welfare. If neither of the bills will create more welfare than the other, then it doesn't matter which one she supports. But if one of the bills will create more welfare than the other, then she votes for it. A consequentialist, such as a utilitarian, supports capital punishment only if she believes that it will produce greater net benefits for society than abolition. There are reasons for retention that almost all consequentialists accept. Knowing that murderers have been and will be executed makes some people happy. Some feel safer knowing that their state has capital punishment. But knowing that their state executes murderers makes other people unhappy, so these considerations do not amount to a decisive consequentialist argument for either position. One reason for retention that all consequentialists accept is incapacitation. Execution completely incapacitates the convict. He can commit no more crimes. Even a convict who's imprisoned for life can commit crimes against his fellow inmates and prison employees. Executing murderers might be the only way to prevent them from committing more crimes in prison. The threat of death might also be the most effective way to deter inmates from killing, although there's no evidence that the threat of execution actually deters them. However, general deterrence of violent crime, inside prisons as well as outside, is the most important consequentialist argument for retention. The question is whether maintaining capital punishment as a policy deters more effectively than would the next most severe penalty available, typically assumed to be life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is a marginal deterrent effect. Consequentialist retentionists argue that capital punishment has such an effect. Consequentialists who deny marginal deterrence usually favor abolition because execution has some very bad effects on the convict and any loved ones, and they believe that nothing less than protecting others from violence can outweigh such bad effects. Whether capital punishment deters violent crime turns out to be an extremely difficult question to answer. It's not a philosophical question, but an empirical one, although careful reflection is required to evaluate various empirical answers that researchers offer. It's sometimes observed that the vast majority of prison inmates on death row try to avoid execution, which strongly suggests that they prefer life in prison over death. Does this fact suggest marginal deterrence? Not necessarily. The question is whether anyone who commits a capital crime, when the threatened punishment is life in prison without parole, would have refrained from the crime had the death penalty been in place. Many abolitionists argue that this is unlikely because life in prison without parole is already a terrible punishment. They claim that anyone who'd risk life in prison to commit murder would probably risk the death penalty as well, so there's no marginal deterrence. Social scientists have extensively studied the deterrent effect of capital punishment, but they haven't reached consensus. Some studies compare the murder rate in a state without capital punishment to the rate in an otherwise similar state that has capital punishment. There's no consistent pattern of lower murder rates in states with the death penalty. Other studies look for correlations over time between fluctuations in the murder rate and the execution rate. Others look at the murder rate in death penalty states during the period 1972 to 76, when states stopped performing executions as the result of a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. The murder rate rose over those 4 years in states that had previously executed murderers, but it also rose in other states, and it continued to rise after states reinstituted the death penalty. Some argue that executions actually encourage at least some individuals to kill, perhaps by conveying a general disregard for the sanctity of human life, or perhaps by some other mechanism. This is known as the brutalization effect. If the brutalization effect exists, then it could account for the inconclusiveness of the empirical research. Perhaps executions deter some murders while encouraging others, with the brutalization and deterrent effects counteracting each other in complicated ways. The most sophisticated empirical studies of capital punishment use data at the level of individual counties. These studies look for statistical correlations over time between executions in a particular county and murders committed there in subsequent months. A complex statistical technique called multiple regression analysis is used to rule out variables that could account for apparent correlations in order to estimate the likelihood that executions have a causal impact on the murder rate. Some prominent recent studies conclude that, statistically speaking, a single execution deters many murders, perhaps as many as 18. These studies have been criticized on methodological grounds that I can't examine now. But we may someday have conclusive research on deterrence. If the research reveals no marginal deterrent effect, then the deterrence argument for capital punishment collapses. But what if the research reveals substantial deterrence? In that case, principled consequentialists will no longer be able to claim that the death penalty is morally objectionable. In fact, some scholars argue that in the face of convincing evidence for deterrence, the state would be morally obligated to institute the death penalty. Their argument is simple. The state has a moral duty to minimize the loss of innocent life. The death penalty minimizes the number of innocent lives lost. Therefore, the state has a moral duty to use the death penalty. Critics of this argument reason as follows. True, the state has a moral duty to minimize the loss of innocent life, but it also has a moral duty not to kill someone who poses no imminent threat to others and who doesn't consent to be killed. A convicted murderer poses no imminent threat. He's in custody and incapacitated. Therefore, the state has a moral duty not to kill him. Abolitionists argue that this duty is much stronger than the state's moral duty to deter murder. If the state abolishes the death penalty and murders occur as a result, then the state has knowingly allowed murderers to take innocent lives, which is unfortunate, of course. But if the state executes a murderer, then it has itself intentionally killed a helpless person. The abolitionist argues that intentionally killing a helpless person, even a convicted murderer, is morally worse than knowingly allowing 20 or 30 helpless persons to be murdered. Retentionists challenge this claim, as do most consequentialists. The philosophical issues get quite involved, and the debate continues today.